I'm really excited about tonight with this panel for Media Madness. This is the third time we've done this, and Lord willing, it'll be the first time we've done this where the microphones work. So this is going to be an exciting
I think it's going,
time.
Travis. It's working.
Is it working?
Sibilance.
Can you hear me?
Test.
Can you hear me
1,
now?
2.
Okay.
Test
good,
1, 2.
Good.
All right.
Wow, we got more than one microphone.
I
That's
do remember
good.
the microphone's not
Good.
working now that you say that.
Well, you should also remember me pulling your ass out of the fire when it wasn't working.
Okay. You can't
remember?
start band
Okay,
rain until
yeah.
you get introduced. We do have rules in Nacogdoches sometimes. So thank you. Welcome to the Media Madness panel. This is something we kind of dreamed up. We thought, what could be more fun as elected officials? These guys usually talk bad about us when we're not around them. And we pick them, they read the nasty things that they say, and we can't rebut them. I said, what could be better than to bring them to Nacogdoches, Texas, the birthplace of Texas, and then get them a few drinks and get them on the stage, and then let them say all these things about us to our face that we never get to see in person. And I say,
Travis, you know that real friends stab you in the front.
Yes, I've got the scars to prove it. So, but really true. These guys represent what I think is the best in journalism. They are in a much maligned profession, probably just a little bit above politics. I'm a firm believer that freedom of the speech, and by the way, yes, as a lawyer, I'm saying this, but the freedom of the press and the ability to have voices heard and to tell those stories, whether they're popular with the government or not, are very important. We can see this playing out in what's going on in Europe right now, what's going on in Russia. The ability of folks like this to do the research, to tell the stories, I think is critical to our democracy. And so I thought this is a good way for us to kick off what we're doing. So tomorrow we'll do wonky panels. We'll have the senators and the representatives, talking about different issues, healthcare. We'll be talking about infrastructure. We're talking about the social media divide, all these different issues. But that all happens within the context of politics. And these are the commentators that really, I think, have the most influence throughout the state of Texas and really have a national effect on how they report politics and what's going on. And I do think that they bring, we don't always agree. We do sometimes agree. But they bring a perspective that's important to put what's happening in elections in the context that leads to policy. So let me introduce these folks. Our moderator tonight is going to be Henderson's own, but now Nacogdoches NISD Communications Director, Les Linebarger. Les has been in that position, about 4 or 5 years? But he bleeds ink. If you don't know Les, he was formerly the editor of the Henderson Daily News and other newspapers before that, and so comes from that. And it's a tough world out there in print journalism, as Brother Garrett can tell us. It is a hard place to be. But Les is going to be our moderator, and so he's talking to his fellow journalists in the Fourth Estate, and it'll be a good rousing discussion. Bob Garrett is here with us, a longtime participant in this. Bob has ties here. Jim Garrett's his brother. His father recently passed away, and again, sorry about that, but happens to us all. But Bob has Nacogdoches roots. It's not hard to get Bob to come back home. And so it's good to have Bob here. Dallas Morning News. He is in Austin, but he's the you can correct this, but he's the head honcho of the Dallas Morning News political stories. Jim Henson is here with us, University of Texas, Texas Tribune, all sorts of stuff. You can't flip on the TV in Austin and not see Jim Henson. I mean, he's everywhere. He's a great Muppeteer, if you haven't seen.
No, that's the first time I've heard that.
Yeah, and so, but no, Jim's very insightful, and also he brings to it. A lot of people have opinions. Jim actually backs them up with statistical demographic data, does a lot of polling, so he has a very interesting take on that. Jay Root, sitting next to him. Jay came out here, and I will tell you, Jay's in East Texas, born and bred. We had our first, segue one story, we had our first one out here. The hotel was closed, and so we had to go out there. We went to the owner of the hotel, the DeWitt's place, and we set up some tannerite targets. Is Senator Taylor in here? Good, because I can tell this story. So now senators get deferential treatment. I see our 3 of our senators right here, and 2 of them are house trained, which is good. Nathan, we're going to have to coach you up. You got a ways to go. But we got our senators here, but Larry Taylor came in, and so we set up these tannerite targets across the lake. And, I mean, there's a reason you have a federal agency, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It's like peas and carrots. Those things go together. And so we're out there and we're shooting. And Jay, so it really struck me. Taylor's trying to hit this target. He shoots 7 or 8 times. He couldn't hit his butt with both hands. And handing the gun to Jay Root, who Jasper, I got this right, Jasper, Liberty. I will tell you, fellas that shoot really good at night, you have to wonder about their hunting practices. Okay, Jay, one shot, boom, he blows up his tannerite target, lights up the sky, hands the gun back. That was nicely done, Jay. So, but Jay's here, Houston Chronicle, a great investigative journalist. He's probably going to make some of my colleagues a little uncomfortable if he looks at you too long. But so be nice, Jay. Be nice. And then, of course, on the end, Scott Braddock here with the Quorum Report. He has done a great job. Scott and I have a tradition. We honored it here today. We meet at our place in upstairs at the loft and have a cigar and an adult beverage before we come here and have more cigars, more adult beverages. So that we've started it off with Scott.
The alcohol, the tobacco, and then
whatever
firearms.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah.
And Scott does a great job of commenting on what's going on in state politics. But what I'd like you guys to do, since I'm going to pitch this over to you, since you are the moderator, just tell us what's going on in the world. What's the political zeitgeist in Texas? What do the primaries mean? What are the runoffs going to do? What's going to happen in the general? Just share your wisdom, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you, Travis. Let me check the time. Well, I'm sorry, our media panel's over. And let's be clear about something first before I dive off into this. He was mentioning, he was gesturing in this general direction about this immense amount of journalism talent up here. Since the first day of baseball season today, baseball's back. Here's the comparison. These guys play in the majors. I play for a semi-pro team sponsored by J. Bob's Liquor Store. So let's just be clear about that before we get started.
Hey, our Astros played that way for a long time and then won the World Series. Don't go there.
All right, thank you guys. Let's go ahead and get started. First question. 4 years ago, the last time we had this, because of something that happened in 2020, the theme of the media panel in 2018 was Divided We Fall, the polarization of politics. So, 4 years later, what's changed? Scott, you're making eye contact with me. I'll let you go first.
If I'm making eye contact, that's the first sign that something's wrong. In the meantime, I was looking at some polling early, and Jim will speak to some polling as well. Jim loves data. He always brings it. Looking at some polling is fascinating about the decisions that President Biden is making about the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Eastern Europe with Russia. And, if you ask people, do you agree with doing this? They'll say yes. Do you agree with doing this? They'll say yes. Do you agree with doing this? They'll say yes. And all of them are things that President Biden is doing. And then do you agree with President Biden's handling of the war situation? And then the numbers flip. Because, you can read that however you want to read it, but in a lot of ways, it's because people are, married to the jersey that they're in. They're upset about a lot of different things that are going on in the country. And I would say in the last 4 years, it has definitely been a downward spiral, and there's no other way to say it in the way that our political discourse has evolved. It gets worse and worse all the time. I had a TV producer a couple of days ago reach out to me and say, "Hey, I like the stuff that you do on this TV segment. You really tell it like it is. Do you want to come on and debate people who are either on the right or on the left?" I think of telling it like it is as a journalistic function and not necessarily being something where I would have to be on the other side of somebody. I would think that facts should be nonpartisan or non-ideological, but we're not there at all in the United States and here in Texas.
Thank you, Scott. Jim, you pulled your microphone up in a hurry. Do you have something you want to add to that?
Well, I'm going to be wonky about this, I fear. And usually, you're very lucky because usually I'd have like oh, let me make a really interesting point with like a half dozen slides, and people would just be pouring, like running to the exits. But I mean, I think underlying this right now, and if you compare to where we've been to where we are now, what's really driving a lot of this is what we call negative partisanship and negative party identification. And it's what grounds some of these responses to the candidates, I think, that Scott is talking about. And what I mean by that is if we go and we ask people, do you approve or disapprove of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? Take a Republican. If I ask a Republican that, about a fifth strongly approve of their own party, but about 80% strongly disapprove of the opposing party. And so to summarize it, and that's true on both sides, the proportions are a little bit different. For a long time, negative partisanship was stronger among Republicans. Democrats are now beginning to catch up. And so what that means is that when you get to the kinds of questions Scott is talking about policies, about political figures, basically, put simply, you get most intense in your dislike for the opposite party. It actually outweighs your attachment to your own party. It's hard to break out of that, and it has all kinds of implications. So, for example, in an upcoming gubernatorial election, if you're trying to plan, if you're the out party and you need to mobilize your own voters, plus theoretically try to convince some other partisans to switch, to cross over, it's a pretty tall order because of that deep cognitive dislike that's driving people's political behavior. And imagine that with like a bunch of bar charts.
Right. I see that right now.
No, I know I paint a very vivid picture.
I think what you're saying is that I really like the Arkansas Razorbacks, but I totally hate LSU Tigers. That's a similar thing, I think.
Right.
Jay, you have some thoughts on this?
I was here in 2018. I don't even know how you can compare 2018 to now. In 2018, we had a guy named Beto O'Rourke running for statewide office. Greg Abbott was running for re-election. He had more money than God. We had a crisis on the southern border. We had the Republicans controlling all statewide offices in the legislature. In Washington, D.C., there was this Supreme Court confirmation hearing that turned into a circus, right? So how is that similar, right? It's still the same. We're still as polarized as ever. But my favorite expression in the world is it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. It's been attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt. I think others have said it as well. But I want to light one candle, and I want to say thank you to Speaker Dade Phelan for allowing us reporters back on the floor of the Texas House of Representatives. It really matters. I would like to push him a little further and let us, hey, James White, did you vote against that?
Did you?
Okay.
Jared Patterson's not here. He voted against it. Because he hates the Texas Tribune, which I don't know what has to do with me.
But I think it really makes a difference. I hope that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, or if there's a Democrat in that office, that they will restore it in the Texas Senate. I know it's not an issue that gets a lot of attention, but it really matters, and it really was an improvement. And I think for me, that is something that is better than what happened before, which is that we weren't allowed on the floor for a while.
Thank you, Jay. Bob, you have anything to add to that?
No.
All right, thank you.
Why does hey,
I would like
Jay,
to take a moment and say that Bob is now my favorite panelist.
He's pretty good at this. Jay, why does it matter for us to be on the floor?
Well, and again, like I said, I want to push the speaker a little bit more to let us mill around a little better because we have been pinned in. I think it's better for the voters. It's better. It's pro-transparency. It's pro-little guy because it's very hard to understand legislation. I can't tell you how many times as a reporter I've been in the situation where something just passed But what's written, the written materials we have aren't any good anymore because it got amended. Well, how did it get amended? Well, I need to go talk to the author really quick, or the author's aide that's going to tell me, no, this changed. This is how it changed. This is how it affects the people of Texas, right? Which is who y'all were elected to serve and who we're trying to serve through our news articles for them being accurate. And it really does matter for us to understand what's going on. And I think we should all be respectful. I think we should respect decorum. We have to wear a tie. We have to wear a jacket. If you don't want me to wear jeans, I won't wear jeans. I feel like it's very important for us to be in there, see it while it's happening, talk to the people that are behind the scenes while it's happening.
Well, Les, let me say one other thing about that. And because we have legislators in the audience, I would be missing an opportunity to say this. We're one of the few states that allows reporters that kind of access on the floor. Previously in the House and Senate, and I respect the legislators and their decision to run the House and Senate however they want. But do you know why reporters are allowed that kind of access in Texas? Do you know when that happened? It was after the Sharpstown scandal, when a bunch of lawmakers lost their offices because there was a scandal, and I won't go into all the detail, but it was because there was a lot of things happening in the dark. Right? And the more you can have journalists in the mix, the better people act, period. And by the way, I've had corporate lobbyists who work in various states in Texas and other places say that when journalists are there with the lawmakers, they act different. And they don't mean that they act worse, they act better when we're watching what they do.
All right, Scott, I think you almost veered us off into a journalism course, maybe sophomore level because you invoked Sharpstown. So thank you for that. Bob, I'm coming to you. You can't stick with no the whole night. Following this same line of somewhat of what things are like, the polarization and all. There's people around, well, not just in Texas, around the country, who feel that newsrooms, whether in print media, television, radio, and everything else in between, because I realized I just left out things like the Texas Tribune by not mentioning online only. There's this belief or conviction in many cases that those newsrooms tend to lean to the left politically. And even in small town Texas, I've heard that accusation back when I was working in newsrooms as well. I always tried to tell them, trust me, they don't lean anyway here. It's all over the place. But is that kind of question, is that to question, or is that concern fair? Or is there anything, how would you address that?
Les, I've been doing this for nearly 50 years, so I would if you indulge me, a story of Paul Doc Bullitt. And when I was a kid, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. My parents were from Texas, but I grew up there and it had a great local newspaper. And I always wanted to work for the Courier-Journal, and I finally got to intern there when I was in college. And Paul was a guy who'd never been to college. He was a great reporter, and he was a blue-collar guy who lived in southern Indiana, and he would bring in, produce and eggs from his farm, and he had his bass boat, and he was out on the lakes on weekend. And one of the famous things that happened every year was he hated wearing a tie, and he would come in. This was in the 1970s when those wide ties, I don't know if you ever seen those. There was a legislator named Jumbo Ben Atwell that was famous for big wide ties in Texas. But anyway, long story short, once a year they would all gather around his desk in the newsroom, and he had a tie he would wear one time a year, and it went all the way down to below his knees. He would stand up on his desk, and they would give him a big pair of scissors, and he would cut it literally off into a waste basket. And I tell that story because the newsrooms that I first worked in were not full completely of college graduates. It was a craft. It wasn't a profession. And these were, monopolies for local advertising that had a lot of money. If you had a good local publisher, they had a lot of reporters. If you had a bad local publisher, you didn't have that many reporters. The Louisville Courier-Journal was a model owner who took about 2 or 3% profit a year out of it, which was unheard of. And what's happened in the, fast forward is of course, the internet and everything has disrupted that model of monopoly advertising, and the shrinkage of newsroom spots. They're all now highly educated people coming out of all the universities. So I think there is something to say that if you believe higher education has been taken over by 60s radicals as faculty members, these kids are people that were taught by a lot of those 60s radicals.
Did you just blame liberal newsrooms on the university, Mr. Garrett?
Yes.
I think he did.
Yes, he did.
I just think there's not any
Very much.
Paul Doc bullets around, Jim. So it's a whole different world. In some ways, it's better because in my entry era, it was almost all white males. Now it's much more diverse. But in that sense of education levels, and then
Bob.
hey. Anyway,
Travis.
I liked it better when you weren't saying anything.
Hey, Bob,
Travis, it's a panel.
Bob, you need some help. So
I think Jim wins the sock contest.
Bob, I'm here to help you. So by the time you came along at that time, you were moving toward one newspaper towns, right? But before that, if you go back, there's a reason that people think that a reporter is just supposed to tell you what the Republican said and what the Democrat said, and you figure it out, right? Like, we don't know. I mean, we don't know who's right. One of them might be telling the truth. One of them might be closer to the mark. It was a business decision for reporters to be told that what you need to do is write a story that won't offend people. And here's what happened. About a century ago, you had competition among newspapers in single towns, right? In Dallas, you had 2 papers. In Houston, you had 2 papers. All across the country, you had 2 paper towns. And what were those papers? You had a Democratic newspaper and a Republican newspaper, right? So the Republican newspaper had certain advertisers. Those would be the advertisers that would be on Fox News or Newsmax or OANN right now. And the other newspaper was a Democratic newspaper, and those would be whatever they have on MSNBC, right? So we have a version of it now, right? But at some point, all these towns became one newspaper towns. So when they became one newspaper towns, they were all competing for all the same advertisers, right? They didn't want to offend anybody, so it was a business decision. They wanted to tell reporters, you need to just kind of be balanced and being balanced to the point of doing that at the expense of what the truth is, because fairness is born of accuracy. If one person says the sky is green and one says that it's blue, my job is to tell you who's right and not to just quote the 2 of them.
Jay?
I think I have a little bit different perspective here. First of all, I think that part of what you're seeing in the media is a reflection, and then their frustration with the media is what has happened politically. And we are so divided, and so there's a lot of distrust of the media. But one of the things that we don't realize we've lost, I realize it, and I think everyone up here realizes it, but if you're not in the business, you don't really understand this. But with all of the explosion of social media companies, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, their content is not vetted in the same way that our content is vetted. If my content is vetted, edited, and lawyered, almost everything I write now goes through a lawyer first. Well, with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, where they use algorithms that takes third-party content and then distributes it because it's popular and they make a lot of money, and they've sucked the advertising away from traditional news companies. It's not only that they don't face the same vetting, the main thing is they don't face any liability for third-party content. So if I've written about you and you're in this audience, you probably got a fact-checking call from me saying, look, this is what I have you saying. Is that accurate? Did I quote you accurately? All of that. That doesn't happen on some Facebook post, some third-party Facebook post. And they're not liable. They are exempt from liability under Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act. And because of that, that has contributed, in my opinion, to this polarization, because Democrats go to Democrat-friendly audiences, Republicans go to Republican-friendly audiences, and the, call it if you want to, lamestream media, I'm a part of that. Mainstream media, I would call it. You can call it lamestream if you would like. It's vetted, edited, and lawyered, and we're losing all the advertising, and we've lost something huge that people don't even realize they've lost it.
Here's another way to say that good information you have to pay for. Bullshit is for free online.
See, you know, that I just got edited right here.
Right.
Thank you.
That is my title, you know.
Yes, that would not have appeared in the pages of the Henderson Daily News or Terrell Tribune. Jim, I know we've been talking newsroom-related things, but I didn't know if you needed 60 seconds for rebuttal to what Bob accused you of.
Yeah, personally, yeah, I've trained many liberal reporters. You know, I mean, I don't have a dog in this fight. Ultimately, I would say a couple of things. I deal with reporters a lot. I deal with young reporters a lot. You know, I think something I would add to both, you know, the emergence of social media and the kind of evolution of professional journalism ethics and the ebbing and flowing of partisan structure in the press that Scott was talking about, you know, is that there is something to what Bob is saying. I think of it less as a left-right thing and more as, you know, the rise of journalism school training that is really still very inflected by two things. One, a little more proximate, is a piece of Scott's story, and that is, you know, the definition of the role of a journalist by Watergate for a couple of generations. And in that sense, reporters are trained to be adversarial. And I think that makes people in power generally kind of unhappy. And I think that's kind of their job, frankly. Now, is there probably, as reporters have become more college educated and as there's generational and ethnic and racial and change in the body of reporters out there? Yes. I mean, if you could put a bunch of, young 20-somethings, in a bucket of water like a bunch of apples you're bobbing for and grab one up by the hair and pull them up, the random draw is going to be somebody that is probably a little more left in their persuasion. And then if they select to go into journalism, given, the public service journalism ethic that is out there, that is adversarial to institutions and particularly to elected officials and people in power, and you add to that journalism training, and this is the only reason I'm answering this, so I can bitch about this, really, where it's like you have to do storytelling, tell stories, so that every story now starts with a little narrative. And, I think that both those things rub people that are the object of aggressive reporting the wrong way. I don't expect people to like it. And, I think, so there is probably a center-left movement there, but I think more than that, it's not like the Obama administration loved the press. In fact, they kind of hated him. And so, I think there's something there. I think the fact that there's something inherently liberal about every newsroom kind of misses the fact that it's about the way that people are being professionally socialized to do the job. And nobody, most of the time that you're the object of these guys doing their job, it's probably not because they're telling a good human interest story.
One last question related to the media. And Scott, you kind of dove off into this talking about, these communities, and especially the larger cities, becoming one newspaper towns, needing to soak up as much of that advertising as possible. But here's the question, and we've got some guys with some different backgrounds up here in the media they've worked in. Right now, Bob and Jay are with what I would consider traditional print media newspapers, Dallas Morning News and Houston Chronicle. although Jay has worked for Texas Tribune in the past. Scott works for Quorum Report, a newsletter, subscription newsletter that's been around, predates the internet when it literally was a newsletter. Taking a look at that and considering where we move forward from here, how we expect a independent media to operate, what's the business model going to look like 5 years or 10 years or 20 years from now? I guess who's going to be successful and still be around? Scott, I'll let you dive off in that because you introduced the topic in the first place.
It's always okay to blame me.
That's what Travis said.
I know. Media reinvents itself in Texas and the United States all the time. I think right now that we have, and like I said, these things sort of ebb and flow. You had 100 years ago, you had a media landscape that was obviously not online, but more like what we have now, where people would go to the outlet that most suited their partisan preference. It was interesting, Jim, talking about these kids coming out of J school and how could 20-somethings coming out of J school possibly be more liberal than the average voter in Texas, who's still about 60, right? Who's going to invest in news? I think it's the people in this room. It's the people who are interested in civic life, and you do have to figure out at some point who is your audience, right? I mean, I think that big newspapers struggle with that, right? I think the Chronicle and the Dallas Morning News, legacy media, struggle with that. Who is the audience? Who wants this, right? I remember thinking the Statesman in Austin, when they announced that, because they started printing the paper in San Antonio and then bringing it up on a truck to Austin, they put out a little notice that said that for the Saturday morning paper, they were no longer going to be able to put the Friday night football scores in the next day's paper, right? Because of that.
And this is Texas.
This is why people buy the paper, I mean, I think, it depends on who you're talking to and what community you're in, but folks need to figure out, wherever they are, what it is that their community is interested in. It doesn't have, politics is part of it, but politics is like, your mom telling you to eat your vegetables, before you get to dessert, right? And so you have to build media products around what people want, but also give them what they need as well. And that's a tough balance.
I think we're better off now than we were a few years ago. The Texas Tribune, which I worked for 10 years, I think has done great work, and I'm very proud to have been associated with the Texas Tribune, and I'm also proud to be working for a legacy, I guess call it, newspaper, the Houston Chronicle. We have lost quite a lot. There are a lot of communities, there are news deserts out there, and this has real impact. I see some members who in the audience who have been in the legislature for a long time. I see you over there, Representative Dutton, and I know that you can remember a time when the press corps was much bigger, much, much bigger. The Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald, the Houston Post and the Houston Chronicle, just those together had a huge contingent of people. I remember in the early 90s, I covered Houston City Hall, and there were 2 Houston Post reporters and 2 Houston Chronicle reporters, and I can remember being in that bureau, and when the Houston Chronicle would get a scoop, their little clock radio would come on, and because they would to drown out the sound, and then like that clock radio coming on would just invoke this terror in me, like, oh my God, what do they have, But that was 4 sets of eyeballs looking at the city council agenda, trying to scoop the other one. That competition created a lot of, some of it we were writing the same stories, but those, we were holding them accountable. And the day that the Houston Post folded, Bob Lanier, the former mayor of Houston, held a news conference, and he said, well, there's going to be a lot less chicken shit stories out there. He said, but I will admit it's worse for people that it was good to have the competition, that it was good to for them to be trying to scoop each other. And we've lost something with this, whether any of us realize it. And of course, I get it. You know, if I were a politician, maybe I would do the safe thing and not try to mess with people like me or mess with the mainstream media or whatever. I get it. I mean, you go to where you're going to get the favorable coverage. But as a society and as a people, we've definitely lost something. I am hopeful when I see, for example, the Colorado Sun it's not a nonprofit, it's a public interest corporation. The Texas Tribune is a nonprofit. In Houston, there's a nonprofit that is going to start up and have it's going to compete with the Houston Chronicle. But I personally think it's a good thing to have more eyeballs doing this. So we're better off, but we need to recognize that it's very important to have people looking at government, looking at the budgets, looking at the records, and I hope that we will continue to have nonprofits, a mix of that, and for-profits that operate on the subscription model.
Bob, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, because not only have you been with the Dallas Morning News, I think you said for around 20 years or so. Back before that, you worked for the late, great Dallas Times-Herald, which got into a massive newspaper war, one of the great newspaper wars of the 20th century with the morning news. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, that was the newspaper war that I joined up with after the Times Mirror Corporation, the owner of the Los Angeles Times, bought the sleepy afternoon paper in Dallas. And I had read the Dallas Morning News visiting my grandparents here and in Waco. And if you read the Dallas Morning News in the 60s, I mean, I could not stand the Dallas Morning News. So I was like, where do I sign up to put this newspaper out of its misery? And we had a great run at the Dallas Times-Herald, but unfortunately, that big corporation in Los Angeles lost the Midas touch that it had had up to that point and blew two markets that had entered, Dallas and Denver. And the upshot of that was we made the Dallas Morning News a good newspaper. And there are differences that still persist that are important, but I'm not sure we want to spend too much time on it. But like Scott was talking about the Austin paper. Well, now we don't even have a Saturday print paper. Austin was owned by Cox when some of these things were happening. Now it's owned by Gannett. Jay now works for a Hearst Corporation, which is not publicly traded and has some real cash cow properties that are not newspapers. And he could tell you about them.
Fitch, we have Fitch Ratings Company that they're making money hand over fist, apparently.
You have some really lucrative other arms of Hearst that insulate you somewhat from the vagaries of the secular decline in newspaper advertising and circulation. My newspaper is still has the voting stock controlled by people that 3 people, 2 lived in Dallas and 1 in Austin, who want to have the Dallas Morning News be a good newspaper. They can't, unfortunately, get the younger generation involved. I don't know where all this is going to go, Les, because it's so disrupted. Jay did a good job, I think, of laying that out. I think in towns like Nacogdoches and Henderson and Rusk and Center, you're going to increasingly hear, it's already a discussion of whether government grants should be available to create news outlets that would monitor City Hall and school districts and stuff that are important, because there's been such a hollowing out of newspapers and media that are watching. I mean, there are people who've done studies of news deserts in terms of where there's whole regions of the country where there's no City Hall reporters, no school reporters. And that's a serious issue that Jay, I think, was very eloquent in describing.
Well, Les, I would say one other thing, which is media has to get entrepreneurial. I mean, and it it has a version of that, but you look for openings in the market. So, for example, over the last decade, I don't know how many miles I have put on my truck that's parked right out there because the local newspaper in whatever town or whatever Texas House district has not written one story about the House race in that area. So I go there, talk to people, figure out what's going on. It's a lot of fun for me. You know, I mean, I feel like the Anthony Bourdain of Texas, eating all the food all over this place and visiting with everybody.
And we get to
And
see those
smoking all the
cocktails
cigars.
on Twitter.
And
those photos of
Smoking all the
cocktails.
cigars too.
Follow along for all the cigar pictures. It's pretty good. So, but I'm doing that because the audience back in Austin wants to know what is going on there, what's really going on there. What not what a political consultant said, which is probably close to the truth but a little different. Not what not what the speaker's team is saying, not what the opposition to the speaker's team is saying. They want to know. I had a friend who was embedded in Iraq in the second Iraq War, and he's in the green zone, where they said this is all safe, everything's fine. And he's in his hotel room, and a bomb is shaking the door to his hotel room. The official report was everything is safe here. It's not. You need a real journalist embedded in the area where the action is happening to tell you what's happening on the ground. So you have to. All these media companies. I mean, I do a podcast with the Houston Chronicle, a partnership I'm proud of. You look for the opportunity to use all the tools in your Swiss Army knife, right? You may not use them every single day, but you got to do the podcast, you got to do TV, you got to do the print version, you have to be open to everything. I remember when I worked at Clear Channel Communications, draw the pentagram. When I worked at Clear Channel Communications, which is now iHeartRadio, because Clear Channel became synonymous with radio that sucks. So it's, and you all know it. It's what's funny. It was like, who even knew what it was? When I worked at Clear Channel for about a decade in Houston, they cut the newsroom in half twice. KTRH is a storied, station in Houston. By the way, it was the original KUT in Austin. During the Depression, they sold it to the owners of the Rice Hotel. They put all the material, all the equipment on the back of a flatbed truck and drove it to Houston. They renamed it KTRH, which is an advertisement, come to Rice Hotel. It's just cool stuff. But at one point, I think they had 50 reporters at that radio station. If there was a hurricane anywhere on the Gulf Coast, they sent somebody. For the decade I was there, they had about 20 reporters when I worked there. They cut it in half twice. I didn't like the fact that they were laying off my friends. But you know what? Every one of the people they laid off was the one who said, oh, by the way, in about 2005, 2006, 2007, people who were saying, I got hired to do radio stories, not internet stories. Those were all the people they let go, to a person. So people in the industry have to realize that they need to go where the story is, they need to go to the medium that they need to go to, the platform they need to go to, whatever it is. Be aggressive, cover the news, however you need to do it. That's who's going to win over the next 20 years.
Thanks, Scott. Before we change topics here, Jay, you mentioned about the immense amount of manpower that the Chronicle used to have on hand compared to today. Same thing at the Dallas Morning News, which I've subscribed to it longer than I haven't, which that means that's been a long time. But I remember back in the early 90s, the Dallas Morning News would almost send a reporter to every sub-regional site of the NCAA men's basketball tournament every year. That's incredible when you think about it, and probably wasn't sustainable at the time, even though myself, I greatly enjoyed it. Let me change directions here. It's an election year. Big surprise there, understatement of the year. First question. Jim, let's start with you. You have something to do with the election and polling. Is the race for governor really a race?
I think it depends what your definition of a race is. I mean,
Is there
look, is there a non-zero probability that Beto O'Rourke might win this race? Yes. Do I think that, Governor Abbott goes into this with significant advantages? Yeah. I don't think that anybody in this room, I'm watching people's face and, there's some partisan differences in the facial expressions, but, if you're going to be clear-eyed about it, Democrats are at a significant disadvantage in that race. And given the terms of where we are now in April of 2022, I don't see how you could not see those advantages as, pretty strongly favoring the governor. Now, if there's anything we've learned since 2015 or so, it's that a lot of things that you think are not going to happen can happen, right? Now, odds are longer on some things than others. But I mean, what I would look at is just how dynamic the environment is right now. That's why I, would have to sort of hedge this a little bit. And this goes back to, since we have a panel of journalists, I mean, for a long time, I worked very closely, with Ross Ramsey, who's going to retire from the Texas Tribune, in putting together the UT Texas Tribune poll. And part of that process would be, we would put together a polling instrument. We would meet with Ross and go through and talk about what was in there and kind of hammer it out. And one of the things that came up a lot through about 2015 is that we have a bunch of questions that we insisted as, sort of academics on the poll that were trend questions, that were things like the right track, wrong track number, what do you think about the state of the economy? And there were times when Ross would look at the trend data and he'd kind of say, he wasn't pushy because Ross is a nice guy, but he'd say, look, this stuff doesn't change very much. If you guys don't want to ask it anymore, I'm fine with cutting it out and putting something sexier on here. Ross would not have said sexier, but that's what he meant. But, and we held on, and if you look at that data and then you start looking after about 2015, all of a sudden it becomes a lot less predictable. We're in a much more dynamic environment. So look, I don't think anybody could really say that the governor Governor Abbott doesn't have significant advantages, some of which come from the powers of incumbency, all the things that people would be familiar with. And what I would flag in that, is that we are in a period now where we have had one party rule in this state for so long that the power, the disadvantage of Democrats relative to Republicans statewide has gone from not just being a matter of who's up and who's down to being a structurally dysfunctional part of the political system. That we've got a broken two-party system right now. That doesn't mean that Democrats are irrelevant or that Democrats in the legislature can't pick their spots and have an impact. But it's a structural feature of the system right now that Democrats are fundamentally weak as a party, and it's hard for them to win statewide elections because of it.
Jay, I'm getting ready to come to you for some follow-up here, but first, Travis, Kelly, I've lost complete track of time. You guys will let me know, right? Do we get the time back? Travis, do we get the time back that you used up here?
Well, the question is, does Larry Taylor, who's arrived, get to give rebuttal?
All right, back to the panel here. Jay, do you have some follow-up to that?
Not really. I'm going to say that you mentioned Ross Ramsey. Ross Ramsey said, "Don't predict the future." I think we as reporters, not as a columnist or an editorial writer, which you're fine to go off and state your opinion, but I think we should pretend like there always is a race and spend a lot less time worrying about the horse race aspect of it. I also do think we would be in a different place right now politically in Texas, including with the Beto O'Rourke versus Abbott race, if Trump were in the White House and not Biden. Do you not agree with that, Jim? I mean, it could totally be a different race, and then all of a sudden it would be, whoa, maybe, that is competitive. So things like that, timing matters, right?
No, the national environment is part of the structural advantages that Republicans are enjoying right now.
And if in 2014, how much money did Wendy Davis have? 30,
roughly,
40 million?
I would say about 40 million spent on her behalf.
And that was the first midterm after Barack Obama's second victory. And in 2018, Lupe Valdez closed the deficit. Wendy Davis lost by about 20 points, and Lupe lost by, 13?
Yes.
And how much money did she have? And was she a better candidate? No. And so what happened in 2018 was Trump did affect that structural advantage for the Republicans. And what do you have this year? Mega money on both sides, a candidate challenger who will work and got a sophisticated campaign, unlike in 2018 Democrats. And but I think everything seems lined up in an adverse way on the national markers of gas prices and inflation and popularity of Joe Biden.
Taking a look at what's going to come next, what's most immediate, the runoffs in May. What about the race for Attorney General? And anybody jump in there between George P. Bush and...
I got one line about that. It's
oh, no.
Here we go.
pinstripes against prison stripes.
Bob Garrett.
He goes blue at midnight.
Have I missed any races that folks should be watching, especially in May in the runoff? There may be a little bit of interest in the Railroad Commission because of Wayne Christian from being from nearby here in Nacogdoches County.
So in the race for Railroad Commission, and Jim spoke just the other day at the Independent Oil Producers Conference in Austin, and all of the candidates were there. Wayne Christian, even interesting moment when the Democrat running for Railroad Commission said, with everything going on with Russia, Ukraine, all this, we need Texas oil and gas more than ever. Full stop. And then I picked up one of those bumper stickers that said, Midland, not Moscow. And the other one said, producing freedom, which I thought looked cooler, but whatever. The challenger in the Railroad Commission race acknowledges everywhere she goes that the reason she's in a runoff is because she didn't spend any money, she wasn't accepting any contributions. There was a video of her that I think was the former land commissioner, Jerry Patterson, that pointed out to me that the video only lasts about 6.73 seconds because he only watched it once. A woman naked on a pump jack and encouraging you to vote for her the next day. A video that was released on TikTok the day before early voting in the primary in March. So anything can happen. I mean, if you're if you're an incumbent in in this state or any state, and you got less than 50% first go around, people are looking for somebody else. So I'd watch that closely.
And I can't remember who said this. Jim, it might have been you. Jay, it was you, Jim, talking about how the polling or how some results started changing about 2015 or 2016, and things began looking differently. And I really, to the average guy like me, since 2020, I just kind of get the impression that whether it's the election, whether it's governance, whatever the case may be, anything can happen. It's just the pandemic and all the fallout from that has just really affected the state.
They look for Wayne Christian to take most of his garments off in a video, though.
Well, and I tell you what, we're grateful for that, right?
Anything's a lot.
We wouldn't be able to unwatch that, though.
And
Just
Scott,
keep that in mind.
Scott, I thought it was 6.74 seconds.
You might have watched it more than Jerry Patterson.
But Dr. Trujillo, not at work. I didn't watch it at work.
In the race for governor, though, can I say one thing about that? Which, and just overall environment in Texas, runoff to the general election. Look, every 2 and 4 years, you get the headlines that say, they ask the question, will Texas turn blue this time? And the answer is always, what? And it just doesn't happen, right? The real story in Texas, until it's different, and look, we're all here, and we'll cover it when it happens. I'm all for competitive elections. Competitive elections are good. The prime example, 2018. You have Beto O'Rourke running. He didn't win to have to help a lot of other people win. 12 new Democrats in the Texas House, 2 new Democrats in the Texas Senate, 2 congressional districts that flipped from Republican to Democratic in Dallas and Houston. And what happened the very next year in that next legislative session? It was the closest thing I've seen to responsible governance in Texas in a long time. Then, of course, Republicans, the GOP strikes back. We're right back to the culture wars that we had been at before because all the action moves to the March primary. And I'm here to tell you, it sounds hyperbolic. Jim will roll his eyes. Here we go. The Republican primary in Texas, there they go. The Republican primary in Texas is the most important election on earth that no one pays attention to, because you have about 500,000 to 750,000 people who make the decisions about the policy prescriptions that will be implemented for about 30 million Americans directly, and then how many states pick up the legislation that we pass in Texas and do it in other places. You're probably getting to around 80 million, 100 million Americans. They're copying our abortion bills right now, all over America, all over the place. Just giving us the high sign. So I'll make the most important point that you'll hear since we're done. Until that changes, the most important election in Texas is the March primary, period, and there has to be focus on that first.
Let the record show I'm not rolling my eyes.
A fly buzzed by him.
Right.
I'm getting the sign from the back of the room. One more question? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I have a list here of some different sessions we're going to have tomorrow. The top one, and I wrote my questions I wrote these, made my notes 2 or 3 weeks ago, and this one in particular has gone through a couple of changes since then. But one of the sessions tomorrow that's going to be here at the Lone Star Legislative Summit, and Kelly told me to mention this, be sure to keep your badge for in the morning, is going to be on immigration. And a lot of things have happened over the past few years on immigration. A lot of things have happened over the past 40 years on immigration. A lot of things happened yesterday on immigration. Which one of you guys wants to tackle that first? Bob's looking straight at me, so we're going to go with him. But
I did cover the governor's press conference yesterday, but give me a question, Les.
what did the decision yesterday to where he announced he was going to they were going to put new immigrants just across from the border on a bus, take them to Washington, D.C. What did that accomplish?
It'll be interesting, Les, to see how many immigrants get on buses voluntarily to go outside of Texas, much less to Washington, D.C. That's going to be interesting to see whether Chief Nim Kidd of Texas Division of Emergency Management has any takers. The other thing the governor announced is going to be a lot of commercial vehicle inspections by DPS on the ports of entry bridges. And then he announced some maneuvers and putting out of razor wire and low water crossings. He says he's going to have more announcements next week. This all happened while the Senate had a new committee on border security had hearings, and we learned about how the costs of this thing have not only, when we got finished legislating last year after, what was it, 237 days, Travis, we had more than quadrupled border security spending, but in the brief time since we stopped legislating in October, I think it was, we now have another $1 billion that wasn't accounted for the National Guard just to get through this fiscal year. So we're now up to $3.9 billion, and then we have to pay for the Guard presumably in the following year in the 2-year cycle. So all of this stuff going on is quite expensive, but I don't think it's hurting Greg Abbott, and it certainly didn't hurt him in his primary, and we'll see whether it hurts him at all in November.
Let me jump on that a little bit. Look, immigration and border security is the Rosetta Stone of Texas politics right now. If you look at polling data, a couple of different points, and I could reel this off, imagine the bar charts again. We ask in every poll, what is the most important problem facing Texas? Like clockwork, for more than the last 10 years, more than 50% of Republicans say immigration or border security. That number will get above 60, sometimes approach 70. So at a time, and this really does connect, and this is why I think it's so central to things we've already talked about. At a time when you have one party dominating the political system so much, and there are disagreements and divisions, as some people in this room will attest to, immigration and border security is the great unifier. You're in a room full of Republicans, particularly Republican voters. You want to get their attention. You want to get them on the same page. Start talking about border security. And we keep seeing the limits to that extended. As people will know, depending on how you want to measure it, the state budget labeled under border security tripled in the last session, from about $1 billion to over $3 billion. Think about that. And those of you that follow politics, show me something else where you've ever seen the budget increase that much.
But this National Guard thing, on the current course, it'll be 5.3 billion
Right.
for this biennium.
Right. And so when we ask Republicans after the session, or we ask Texans, do you think the state should spends about the right amount, should spend more, should spend less on border security? Again, more than half of Republicans say we're not spending enough. It is the key issue for Republican candidates, particularly if you're running statewide, but I would say probably for legislative candidates. You know, you want to do something interesting, go to YouTube, look at campaign ads from the governor down to dog catcher, and you'll find people finding a way to Republican candidates finding a way to campaign on border security.
And it works, right? It works. But, and part of it speaks to the problem that Democrats have. Did you notice that there were 2 Democratic congressmen, one from Laredo, the other from McAllen, who signed on to this letter to President Biden? However, have you noticed the huge disconnect that no one ever talks about, which is the demand side? Who is taking all this dope? Who is hooked on opioids, and where did they start? And so, and where is the hard dope coming across? It's not coming across the river. It's coming across the bridges. It's coming across the ports of entry, hidden in little compartments. There are people that are staffing that. We have federal officers, CBP officers. None of this matters, mind you, because nobody cares to talk about the details and the fact that we had a drug war for years and years and years on the federal side. It's like we discovered it in Texas, right? But does it work to focus on just the supply side? And you can say, oh, yeah, well, it's fentanyl. We got to stop the fentanyl. Well, the fentanyl is coming across in tiny little packages in cars that's going across bridges, right? And then who's hiring all these people? Who's hiring all these undocumented workers? I can take you to a work site. I promise you, we could leave here right now, and in 10 minutes, I could find you a work site. Maybe they're not there right now. Maybe they've already gone home for the day. We'll come back tomorrow and try it. Okay?
Probably there now.
But I promise you, the workplace, the undocumented workplace, there ain't no rule of law there either. Let me read something to you, and you tell me who said this in 2009. You just tell me. Somebody stand up and tell me who said this. I will not sleep at night knowing that some employer in this state, because we refuse to act, is allowed to treat someone like a slave in the United States of America. In 2009, who said that? Anyone know? It was for a bill that would take licenses away from companies that were hiring undocumented immigrants. Who knows? Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick. Where did that bill go? What happened? Why isn't the Republican legislature, why aren't Democrats demanding that the workplace be safer for employees as well? I mean, because they're getting exploited in the workplace. I mean, this is something that's being totally ignored. Why is that?
Because everything is performative. I'll give you another quote. The governor on the Rio Grande in his Carhartt jacket says that if Washington won't secure this border, then Texas will. Who said that and when? Rick Perry in 2006. The same exact thing. And you know that if you go back and look at not polling, but if you look at the election results, up until 2000, and that was with a Republican in the White House, right? If you look at the election results, the Hispanic share of Republican voters was increasing election cycle after election cycle until then, started to go back down, started to increase again, but only in certain areas, right? I do think that, probably a good thing to end on, One thing that I think gets overplayed a little bit is this discussion about what's happening in the Valley, where you do have a serious, challenge happening with Republicans going in saying, we're going to open up a new front in Texas. We're going to get a lot of these folks who have been voting traditionally Democratic to vote for Republicans in the Valley. It's only 4 counties. It's not the entire part. It's not the entirety of South Texas. But you do have some cultural things that are happening there. You do have a lot of folks who, and the dirty secret about immigration and illegal immigration with the Hispanic vote is that at some point people are not migrants anymore; they're Americans, and so those are the people who came after me, right? So you'll have a continuing debate about that. We'll see how far they get with that. I would say that it would be an interesting moment for the Republican Party in Texas to have, if those are moderate Democrats who are willing to vote for Republicans, that would mean we'd have a lot more moderate Republicans in Texas, which would be a good thing.
Travis, I'm going to ask one more thing really quick. No,
I've got that right here. That's on his other.
Larry Taylor can't shoot, is what he said.
hey,
Larry wasn't in here. Larry.
let me Hey, let me tell you right now, when Travis first ran for the State House in Rusk County, he blew the budget at my newspaper for legal pads out of the water because he could talk so fast and cover so much ground that we got halfway through the campaign and I realized I'm going to have to make a budget transfer here so I can buy some more legal pads. Okay. Okay, guys, one question. I want one name from each of you. Bang, bang, bang. Who is the GOP nominee for president in 2024? Scott, start with you and come this way.
Donald John Trump.
Jay?
I don't predict the future. Sorry.
Jim?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't.
Bob?
I was going to say at this point in earlier cycles, I would have said Rudy Giuliani,
Jeb Bush.
Jeb Bush. I guess I would just differ from Scott, would say Ron DeSantis. He does seem to be on a roll, and it's very daunting, I would think, for Dave Carney or anyone in Abbott's camp to try to write a scenario where they can overtake Ron DeSantis.
Well, I was just saying,
The nastier way to ask that question would have been to say, "Tell me who's not going to be the candidate."
yeah, right. Well, there's no way that it would be Donald Trump Jr. because he can't sell tickets in Houston.
Travis, it looks like you're ready to grab the mic from me. Hey, these guys did a great job. Man, it was an honor to be up here with you. Thank you all.
All right, well, I think this concludes tonight's festivities, Kelly, Wayne, right? So thank you for being here tonight. Please make your way to SFA tomorrow for the rest of the Lone Star Legislative Summit. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here and your insight on this. Thank you for being relatively kind in your comments towards us and the elected class. So let's call it a night.